Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Miss Angela Keaton about the costs and destruction of war and the anti-war position. Miss Keaton is Director of Operations at Antiwar.com. She has served on the Libertarian National Committee and was formerly Executive Director of the Libertarian Party of California. She is the former producer of The Scott Horton Show and hosted the Liberated Space Talk and News radio program from 1999 to 2005. You can follow her work on Antiwar.com, on Twitter at Antiwarcom, and on Facebook under Antiwarcom. For more information, see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/war. Angela, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure, and this is such an important topic. So let's just get started and with this question, and I know that this is one that you'll probably have a very rigid view on, but it's just an important way to start out. So when is war justified, and is it ever justified?
Gosh, I'm in terms of antiwar.com, we have a variety of editors, and they all have slightly different opinions on where that begins, including some people who are pacifists. As for me, I'm not a pacifist. I believe in strict self-defense. And I do mean self-defense. I live in West Hollywood, which is an LGBT center in an independent city in L.A., and for various reasons, I love it here. And if someone came to attack us meaning the citizens of West Hollywood, I would absolutely defend myself. And and the same, it would basically just be an extension of like if someone tried to steal from me physically or beat me or rape me, I would strike back. And that's, basically what I would do in self-defense. But it's got to be clearly self-defense. For example, if you haven't been attacked, preemptive strikes are just, it's just a euphemism for I'm going to do violence against someone else and rationalize it under the guise of I think that someone might have wanted to do something to me at some point, or I don't like this particular religious group or racial group or their particular customs, so I'm going to go ahead and do something violent to them and then say it's for their people's good. And which is what's often known as, by the way, humanitarian intervention, which is something that is not self-defense either.
So I know this is kind of brought up occasionally, but World War II is often said as, definitely a war that we were justified to go into. What is your position on that war?
Why would it be justified?
Most people normally cite the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Okay. Let's just say, that was a horrible thing. Let's just say it was provocative. What were the advantages of the United States entering World War II? Who was saved by us entering World War II? No one's life was made better, and despite the U.S. best propaganda, it certainly didn't stop the Holocaust from happening.
That is correct.
Right. No, it's definitely an argument that is filled with holes. But we wanted to bring that subject up because a lot of times when you say that you're against war, people will point to specific wars that they think were good and just that were not necessarily defensive wars. So we just wanted to throw that point out there and to swat that criticism away right at the top.
Well, no, there's several. People who are much smarter than I am. Robert Higgs and Bill Kaufman and many great writers, especially Murray Rothbard, which I know your audience is probably very young, but that's someone I would suggest reading in his words and not what other people say about him, but in his own words. I would also advise reading Carl Hess, some of the real basics of libertarian theory on why these things were wrong. And there's many great historians too that weren't necessarily libertarians who would help flesh that out, like the late Gabriel Kolko, William Blum, Carl Oglesby, and other writers who I think would kind of help illuminate the larger picture on that. The reason why I sort of always get defensive on that is I did not go to conventional schooling for most of my education. They didn't call it homeschool then; we had different names for it, but. One of the reasons why people repeat this thing in World War II was it had inherently good and just. They have no real argument for it, but in government schools, as the libertarians call them, and the government schools are actually much worse than conservatives and libertarians say they are, because they're really the indoctrination centers where you learn that American exceptionalism, empire, and war are good. That's what civics classes are for. They're there to teach you and indoctrinate young people into why it's good to be part of the American empire. And that's where they learn these things. And of course, that's not just a training to, that's not just an ideological statement. I mean, it trains people to think that violence is appropriate and that mass murder is okay. And these are all morally justified positions, even though anyone, and this is always like that great quote of Noam Chomsky, right? I mean, any reasonably smart 10th grader can see through the lies of U.S. foreign policy. But where do people learn that? Most people go to some kind of school, government or maybe privately owned, but the history and the civics classes are all they're taught entirely the same. And you can and for people for people who like to read, both the late Howard Zinn and Tom Woods have great books about kind of dissecting what you're taught in public schools, which is what creates a culture of war and militarism and torture. So that's kind of why my immediate reaction to was World War II justified? No, and especially when people, and I really get really irritated because the people will talk about, what about stopping the Holocaust? The United States did not stop the Holocaust. The Holocaust happened, and horrible, horrible things can never be undone, and the U.S. Could have done very different things, including allowing Jews to immigrate instead of blocking their ability to immigrate here. To stop that, but they chose not to. So, and the U.S. also, by the way, put Japanese Americans and German Americans in internment camps. There's a very good interview recently on Ernie Hancock's show with someone who lived in a German internment camp about that experience. So it's a shameful. World War II is a shameful chapter in U.S. history, but there's a lot of shameful chapters when a country is built on colonialism and expansion and murder. So. There's a long list of those things that we could bring up. I don't know if that helps, but I hope that helps clarify a little bit.
Right. Well, something else that is not really taught in government schools is the human costs of war. There might be specific atrocities that are emphasized, but for the most part, you don't really see pictures. You don't see statistics. There isn't a lot of discussion about the tragedies that come from war and the killings that come from war and the destruction that comes from war. So can you go into the moral reasons for opposing war?
Oh, well, there's many. There's many, and they don't have to be libertarian anyway. I come from I grew up in an anarchist household, so this is kind of the way I think about the world. But that's basically nonviolence and non-aggression are sort of what we're kind of evolving to as human beings. It's the human ape is still pretty violent and abusive, but reason and logic eventually will take hold, and we're evolving out of thinking that it's morally just to go and kill people. The actual ethical arguments are easy. First of all, ask your question why. What kind of system would steal your money and then use it to kill children under the guise of we've got to build the roads? It's certainly not a moral or ethical one. You certainly can't. How can people justify killing civilians anywhere, especially the way the U.S. conducts itself abroad? There's almost never any reason for the behavior abroad because it always ends up in killing, destruction. The Department of Defense is a horrible polluter and is a part of our environmental problems, if not a extensively large part of it. It creates a situation where we can't have proper trade, and without open free trade, goods and services like medicine and technology don't get distributed to places where people need them. Without the U.S., because the U.S. is such a violent moral monster, any good ideas the United States might occasionally have, even though we don't live up to them in any way, like in theory being a somewhat equal society or a society that's supposed to, in theory, shun racism and sexism or whatnot. No one believes us, and no one respects what the U.S. does enough to actually emulate any of the good things that we do. So all those are kind of utilitarian arguments about why war is bad. People aren't going to forgive you if you kill their kids. That's the big conspiracy theory, right? What's 9/11 about? People get really angry when you destroy their country, year in, year out. When you destroy their infrastructure, when you basically mow down their population, when you destroy everything that's functional, when you get rid of governments. And I'm not a fan of democracy, but democratically, when the U.S. overthrows democratically elected regimes, that creates horrible situations. And when the U.S. puts dictators in, that creates a horrible situation. And those situations, they're not even. There's no there's no ethical justification on them. And I think the burden of moral proof needs to be on the people who want to do regime change, who want to overthrow other people's governments, who want to involve themselves in a humanitarian intervention, which is another just euphemism for war. But those are the people who really need to be held. It's nationalists and neoconservatives and neoliberals who are the ones who need to explain why they think their behavior is moral. I think that's where the burden of proof is.
I think that's an excellent point. And another thing that war does is that often it leads to enormous expansions in government. Could you talk a bit more about that and some historical examples of how war has expanded government?
Well, it's happened. I mean, we have excellent examples every day. I mean, one of the points that Antiwar.com tries to make, and we have a great columnist, Lucy Steigerwald, who does the War at Home column, where she looks at and discusses the ways that empire expands government. And the historian Robert Higgs often talks about once those expansions are made, they don't contract. It's not as if no one really gives up power easily or willingly. I mean, that's just the kind of people who seek power, or the institutions that seek power. They don't let it go very easily. So what happens, we have this weird chain, I call it empire police state. I mean, we've had a problem with the police state, police brutality here in the U.S. for a very long time. And if you're black or Mexican American, you have horrible dealings with cops on a more regular basis. But the expansion, every time the U.S. goes to war, there's always new legislation, there's always new laws that come into effect that violate your privacy, that violate your ability to exchange goods and services, that violate your ability to use a medium exchange. I mean, most of our laws about money in some ways have to do with things like the drug war, which is part of empire. I mean, you can't really separate the drug war from our foreign policy. So every time that and of course the drug war itself is a violation of your basic human rights, whether it's, because you've been arrested because you had some plant in your pocket, or because, you're a grown adult who's not allowed to make decisions about his or her own body. Those are just basic, human rights violations, and they're often under the guise of national security. Antiwar.com has been under an active FBI investigation since 2002. The reason why we know it's active is the ACLU is suing on behalf of our founder, Eric Garris, and our editorial director, Justin Raimondo, and through discovery, different discovery and constant, this long ongoing process is what they've learned is that the FBI under FISA has basically been, monitoring, reading, harassing Antiwar.com for many, many years. And that's considered something, because having a website's a national security threat under that logic. Journalism is a national security threat under that logic.
Well, at least they think you're a threat. I mean, that has to mean at least that you're making a difference, right?
Well, I mean, anti-war activists have been under surveillance. I mean, this isn't new, and the left is much savvier and usually smarter about these sorts of things, where they're more aware of the fact that the FBI, has always singled out anti-war groups for these, for surveillance. And the reasons why are pretty easy. It's, the war is the biggest and most important thing the state does.
Well, and it really goes back to that Randolph-Bourne line, doesn't it? That war is the health of the state.
That's right. It's a very healthy state.
Yeah. All right. So one issue that is very important with this whole war issue is war being a welfare program. Can you go into that a little bit and give some examples of how war is such a big welfare program?
Well, I mean, the Pentagon itself, I know that some economists will have differences of this, but the amount that is spent on empire and taxation, it does create, quote, jobs, and I'm using air quotes for jobs. I mean, the Pentagon, Department of Defense employ a lot of people, yet they produce nothing. I mean, the military doesn't make anything. They don't make widgets or gummy bears or good microwave ovens. It's just the military. It destroys. I mean, we'll give the example of Iraq. Iraq was a fairly highly functioning country. I mean, Saddam was no prize, but it was hardly the worst place that one could live, and it did have an entire functioning structure, which the United States destroyed. There's no wealth gained. I mean, very few people gained any wealth because of what the U.S. did. The U.S.'s destruction of property and persons does not create wealth for most of the people it affects. It might create a little bit of wealth for a very, very small group of people, people who own stock in Lockheed Martin, Marietta, Grumman, Bell, Humvee, all the different, they might as well be just one giant arms manufacturer corporation now, but that's who it's, Halliburton, and whatever they're calling Z currently, it used to be, I've forgotten already, the organization that used to be. All those are the only people that Ford creates. Everyone else, it's draining. As far as it being a welfare program, I mean, think about the kind of people that are kind of pushed and cajoled into military service. A lot of poor people in the Southeast. I mean, people who just don't have a lot of financial resources are told, hey, you sign your life away at 17 and we'll get you a free college education. And it's a pretty, the whole process sounds pretty degrading to me, but it is a welfare program. It does create jobs. It does give something to do. It's where we put people that we don't really, that the United States considers disposable. And there's a whole segment of, white men in the Southeast, black men, Latino men, and there's women are involved too. But I mean, mostly it's young men who are being basically shoved into, lied and conned into these, because they're not given usually the whole story. I mean, military recruiters are notorious for lying, and the way that the news is framed and the way the history is taught is that you really have no idea what the hell you're getting into until after you get there. And that's when, like people like Pat Tillman, thank God, left diaries and things behind and wrote a lot so that they could say, like, when they came to that moment where they realized, wow, this is all a bunch of nonsense.
So you picked up on this a little bit, but could you talk a little bit about how certain companies that create goods and products for the military profit from militarism and therefore have an incentive to promote it?
Well, they do. And one of the things is, I guess I'll use the example of Wesley Clark because he's pretty easy to beat up on. He's kind of he's kind of a jerk. His whole personality is just kind of annoying and grating. But if you look at Wesley Clark or look at any of the generals who do regular TV appearances who aren't, let's say, iconoclastic and weird and were against war. I mean, there's always some military figure who turns against the whole thing in a Smedley Butler kind of way. But, most of the generals, they end up on MSNBC and Fox and CNN, and they're essentially spokespeople for the arms manufacturers. And it's not just, the old Eisenhower expression, the military-industrial complex, it's not just the war, it's not just like the neoconservatives, think tanks, and the war machine, the people who make the war weapons. It's the universities that get grants and research development from the military. It's the very fact that if I go into coffee, bean, and tea, hey, buy a pound of coffee for the troops. There's lots of people I wouldn't mind buying a pound of coffee for, but I don't know if that's what we should be doing is you're rewarding a system where people take my tax money, which I don't have a choice. I mean, I pay taxes because I don't want to go to jail. I mean, it's not because I love them or feel that anyone's entitled to my labor besides me. But those, everyone who is in that system somehow benefits from it, even though it may not be directly in terms of wealth. But just the whole way we revere. It's a nationalism, U.S. nationalism, American exceptionalism has long since replaced kind of a mainline Protestant Christianity as the national religion. And there's just aspects of Protestant Christianity, I'm just using that because it's still the majority of religion, is melded so much with empire. And that's true of all the major religious groups. There's a lack of distinction between the major religious groups and the U.S. military and empire's interest in so many cases. So there's almost like no area where the military doesn't touch. I consider myself a fairly radical feminist, and one of the things that I find that's deeply disturbing that doesn't get Christian acceptance except by very radical people is, let's say, how feminism has been co-opted. Like Ms. Magazine, for example, has the Feminist Majority Foundation, or is linked to them strongly, and they convinced themselves that an invasion of Afghanistan would be good for the women of Afghanistan. Now, of course, they're not consulting any of the women of Afghanistan, of course, before they actually made this position. And, there are feminists in Afghanistan, as well as lots and lots of women who aren't political, who, of course, want no part of the, U.S. They don't think an occupational government is going to help their already difficult life situation. So it's militarism and the way we think about it affects everything, and it is a giant welfare program in addition to everything else, because one of the things is like most vets that I interact with, they're very angry about war. I mean, most of them are anti-war. I mean, you occasionally meet America, love it kind of folks, but honestly, most of the vets I run into are very, very angry. They think that war is a lie and the whole system is a sham, and they become pretty cynical. But occasionally I meet these people, and they don't know anything about the site, and they can't read very well, and they'll start screaming at me about daddy's money. I don't know who the hell they're talking about, but they somehow imagine that this is a vanity project, and they make certain assumptions about people who are anti-war, which of course are completely ignorant and stupid. But that has mostly to do with their insecurities and guilt about the fact that, if you're in the military, you didn't create anything, you took money from other people, you aren't leading an honest life, the chances of you being an adulterer or a wife beater or an alcoholic or abandoning your children is pretty high. I mean, it's not, I don't know whether it's bad, whether necessarily people of bad character are the only ones drawn into military service, but it certainly doesn't create good character. It certainly doesn't build character. You're kind of a menace. I mean, one of the things that happens is that, soldiers become police officers, and then they come here and they feel it's perfectly fine to shoot at black children, and that's kind of the normal chain of events now. You go overseas, you come back, you become a cop, and then you become a menace to your neighbors. So none of this is good. I mean, this is all very, very bad. I mean, this is all highly, highly dysfunctional. I mean, it's only functioning for very few people. And if you want to live a very minimal life, this is what we've got, then I guess it's okay, but it's not.
That's quite an indictment on people who work for and in the military. Is there any research about people who come back from the military and how many of them end up doing these bad things?
Yeah, and Ann Jones, who's a journalist who, I mean, she may be well into her 70s or 80s, and she's still very productively writing on these causes. Let me just move over here and get the name of a good book, for example. It is They Were Soldiers by Ann Jones. This book was put out by Tom Dispatch at Haymarket Books. I highly recommend to your readers this very book. It talks a lot about brain damage, suicide, homicidal tendencies, how many families are destroyed when the military comes back, and when a young man kills himself when he returns back, usually it has effects not just on his immediate family but his parents as well. They divorce. The parent might commit suicide and increases that chance significantly. There's also other good research out there, and Antiwar.com does carry quite a bit of this research, but these are all the things that you have to think about. But I'm just going to people saying, well, my brother's in the military, he doesn't do that. I'm sure. I mean, I can point to lots of cases that people don't do that, but we're looking at general tendencies and trends, and these tendencies and trends all point towards violence. And this is kind of why I focus a lot on, talking to conservatives and people of faith about the war, because I'm very, very interested in the idea that people can consider themselves godly or people of faith, yet promote the military lifestyle, which is completely antithetical to family values. I mean, I'm not sure if is divorce a family value, is having, children with lots of different parents where people aren't sure, where the parental structure is wife, beating your wife, and it could be husband beating too. I mean, this also affects women soldiers. I'm just saying that the vast majority of the ones who tend to have these problems are men, but it's hardly a gendered problem. These are all things that are incompatible with family values. So you can't be pro-military and pro-family. And it's the whole pro-life issue comes into play here, because, I mean, if you claim to be pro-life, when you take a position that, polluting the environment so Iraqi women have miscarriages all the time, or an environment where sanctions, which are horrible, where you prevent trade from occurring so that, young people can't get medicine, that's not a pro-life value. I mean, how is that pro-life? I mean, that's why I want people of faith and I want conservatives to answer these questions. It's not just people die, Bush lied, people died, chanting in the streets kind of nonsense. I mean, they're morally obligated to answer these questions and explain them, like how that these are. I don't know how these values can be compatible.
And I think another big tragedy is the fact that really a lot of veterans are kind of kept in the government system They go to the VA to get a lot of their health care done. And we've seen how poor some of the outcomes are at these government-run hospitals.
Oh, the VA is horrible. I was speaking to some vets at an event in Central California not long ago, and there were some, veterans in the audience, and they told me all about just what a horrible situation is the VA. One of the anti-war activists that I work with in the libertarian movement on several projects, he just says you won't go to the VA hospital. It's substandard care if you can get the care at all. Now, I know we as libertarians, we don't believe in welfare, but under the current system, when you think about what happens to vets, and now, this is something I want to clear up with just because I think people misunderstand. A lot of vets who are the age, baby boomer age and older, were drafted into the military. Most of the people who were in Vietnam did not enlist to go to Vietnam; they were drafted. And the draft, which is a horrible, horrible thing if you think about it, right? Where we draw up lottery numbers to decide which young man is going to have his private parts blown off. Something, by the way, that happens lots of times in combat, but no one mentions that. Your military recruiter isn't going to say, I don't want to be vulgar, but by the way, there's some chance your penis might never work again if you are in a combat situation. These are the sorts of things that happen to people who serve in the military. There's got to be some obligation if you want these wars. And you're insisting on this way of life, that there's got to be somebody. There's got to be some accountability in the sense that the VA hospitals have at least a minimal duty to make sure that the basic physical needs of these men and women are met. So it's I don't know, it's just a really ugly situation all the way around, but I just wanted to make sure that we mentioned something about the draft, because one of the things that, and this was never, when I was growing up in a different, more radical time, the feminist movement never would have stood for a draft, let alone this whole idea of expanding the draft to women. I mean, when is imperialism a progressive value? I've never understood the way the world is working toward that mentality. I mean, I've been an active member of the LGBT community ever since I came out, and it does nothing but make my head hurt when I think about how don't ask, don't tell evolved in a situation where we have gay lawyers in D.C. fighting for the right to go and kill people. And even trans women, who usually are really progressive and anti-authoritarian on these things, even some have we've got to, we also want rights to fight in the military. And to me, that just is this idea of a right to be in the military, this right to kill people, is really, it's something really twisted. And I don't know what can stop it other than explain to people how people are co-opted and how every liberation movement gets co-opted and stolen by the state to be integrated into the military.
Now, I want to move on to another one of the really horrible aspects of wars, and we've touched on this some already, but that's the erosion of civil liberties that results. I guess this has sort of been a theme throughout American history, but we've especially seen this in the post-9/11 era, so this is something that I would assume everyone in our audience has seen firsthand to some degree. But can you explain how war leads to the erosion of civil liberties and talk about how that has played out a little bit in the United States in particular?
Well, here's, this one of the basic, those basic right, let's say the right to be, let alone the right to be allowed to go about your business in peace. Everything about our lives is electronically monitored at this point. And that used to be only the province. People used to say that we used to call them tinfoil hat people 30 years ago. But the reality is, if you look at the way of technology, everything is monitored. We know there's 17 intelligence agencies. We know the NSA collects data all the time. And the data, including the three of us went offline here and had a private conversation, there is no private conversation to be had. We're not allowed to have one because of national security. And it's expanded in all sorts of ways. I mentioned earlier, one of the things about money is that eventually, the idea of eliminating cash is partly discussed under a way to, curb terrorism, right? So in other words, you can't make any kind of transaction that's even private once you've eliminated cash. So in every way, in every level of our lives, the state is working and its empire is working to destroy our sense of self and our privacy. So the civil liberties violations are nonstop. They're constant. I mean, just if you think about all the major almost all the presidential candidates that were serious in one of the two war parties had some kind of bold statement that was a horrible violation of civil liberties. And Bernie Sanders is considered maybe the least offensive of any of these candidates. Even this is a couple months ago, one of the Saturday night, I don't know why you'd have a debate on Saturday night, but basically opened on, more or less going to declare, war on the whole Muslim world. And he's the most rational, peace-like guy in the mainstream. But all of them had horrible, horrible things to say about the, basically Muslims and Arabs as being non-human. And you have Donald Trump talking about how we're going to deport millions of Muslims somewhere. Just crazy talk. But these things could be very real. I mean, the internment camps were real. Locking people away for their political ideas are real. Political prisoners are real. I mean, Chelsea Manning is in prison for what essentially is going to be the rest of her life, no matter how we try to, no matter how we phrase that. She's a political prisoner. Edward Snowden really can't come back to the U.S. He's stuck in exile. Julian Assange is basically the same thing. They're trapped in exile. Snowden and Manning are American citizens, of course, but I mean, just the fact that the U.S. can, violate the civil rights of other people's nationals is something that's truly sickening.
So how, as a civilian, can you protest the war state? And can you talk a little bit about how people from the left and people from the right can come together to oppose war?
One of the most important things you can do as a civilian is talk to people. I don't mean activists. I don't mean other libertarians. I mean talk to normal people when it comes up about the war. And you can do it in a way that doesn't put people in the defensive. Ask people questions. I mean, ask their questions about, like, well, what were your expectations about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan? What were you hoping to do there? Do you think those needs been met? Has that been fulfilled? What about Iraq? Why were we there? Why do you think we were there? What benefits have Americans actually benefited from the endless occupation of Iraq? Talk to people about that, and also ask them too. I mean, how these things, fit into their religious beliefs if they have them. We're dealing with people from, liberals. The left is a little easier to solve the anti-war matter, but liberals can be a lot harder. Liberals are not the same as the left. Obviously, I think your audience understands that, but it has to be explained. When people talk about humanitarian interventions, ask them, were any wars stopped or any lives saved by the U.S. military's intervention somewhere, and see what they come up with. There's a lot of things that can be asked. I mean, if liberals can rationalize war, they're rationalizing homophobia, they're rationalizing sexism, and they're particularly rationalizing racism. I mean, racism is the table leg of empire. So can you be a good liberal and support war? I don't think so. Now, as far as working with the left, I'm really strong in what we call, left-right against the war, and I would love to see more people get together. We had a project that was very popular in 2010, 2011 called Come Home America, where we brought people from all different parts of the political spectrum, and that wasn't the hardest part, is getting leftists to work with us. And one of the parts actually that was hardest were getting libertarians to work with each other. As you might know, libertarians have a tendency to be sectarian and insane about their own weird hang-ups as everyone else is. So what's really important is to get people to get over their weird little quirks and just really focus. A narrowly focused but broadly based anti-war movement will be the one that succeeds, the one that appeals to the masses, and the one that stays very, very focused on ending war. And the closest we came to that, and probably the best situation we had for that, was when Ralph Nader and Cynthia McKinney and Chuck Baldwin and Ron Paul came together in 2008 to say, let's audit the Fed. Let's look at the Fed. Let's restore civil liberties. Let's restore civil liberties and get rid of the national security state, and let's basically withdraw our troops from most places. And that's something we can all agree on, and it's really, really big. So this is where this is where we can make a difference. Really, this is where libertarians can lead. When we, when we get past our other weird, strange issues with each other, we can really work together to stop war. And one of the most exciting things that's happened in the past couple of months is that the Free State Project has finally met a certain numerical goal, and eventually New Hampshire will be probably the largest concentration of anti-war activists anywhere. And that's something that maybe, that might be a clue, a hint toward the future, I guess, that these things can happen. So I'm big on people getting past their weird hang-ups and working with people from other ideologies to end war. When I was a little kid, and I grew up and was a libertarian, we didn't have enough libertarians we had to all the time work with the people, and I mean all kinds of people, and I mean all kinds of right-wingers, John Birch Society people, and people on the hard left, Earth First types we would work with. Lots of people on the hard left we worked with, on the drug war, on civil liberties violations. And that was what we had to do because there weren't enough people. It really wasn't until the Ron Paul campaign of 2008, which is kind of a surprise, it kind of was like a late-in-life move for Ron Paul that I didn't expect, is that there are now enough libertarians for it to matter. There's enough libertarians that are capable of doing things to change the world. And one of the things we could do that would really actively change the world is lead an effective anti-war movement.
All right. Well, on that note, let me just ask you before we go what the best way is for our audience to follow your work and what you recommend someone who's interested in this issue read, whether as a beginning level or for more advanced levels.
If you go to antiwar.com, you'll find some essays from the great Murray Rothbard. If you look into the section Who We Are, there's those essays as well as the Randolph Bourne's initial essays, the one where we learn the expression "war is the health of the state." Also, for those of you who don't always have time to read but can do podcasts, I recommend the Scott Horton Show. It's scotthorton.org. Scott is our opinions editor here at antiwar.com, and that's a place where you can get started and will make a huge difference, I think. But there's lots of great anti-war work throughout the libertarian movement.
All right. Well, yeah, I definitely agree with your recommendation that our listeners check out Scott Horton's program.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic. And on the Murray Rothbard note, I know there's a piece that's on antiwar.com. I think it's called Murray Rothbard on War, and he talks about some of the government expansion that came out of the Civil War and the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812, along with numerous other topics, and it touches on the American Revolution a little bit, so we'll definitely link to that, and we'll, of course, link to Randolph Bourne's essay and everything else you've mentioned. So on that note, I want to remind everyone to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/war. They will be able to find all of the links that we've discussed there and related resources, and I want to thank you for coming on the show today to discuss such an important topic.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I hope to be on again someday.
Well, definitely. We look forward to having you back.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.